try to summarize quite an amount of work in only 10 minutes, but I think I'll try to stick with the time. So around the OECD, we're also working on such a vision. We have a forthcoming event. I'll talk about it later. So I'm happy that organizations such as the European Commission or us are walking sort of like hand in hand towards the same direction. Perhaps the first thing that I would like to mention is this need for diversity of places. And we heard before the topic of diversity of places. On our side, you know, the old definition of rural being the leftover of urban is something that we're still coping in terms of understanding the diversity of rural places. Although we always recommend countries to have their own definition, it's not the same to do rural policy in a country like Canada to a small country. We do think that in broad terms, there's three types of rural. The ones that are inside the functional urban areas, the ones that are in proximity to cities, and the ones that are remote. And we think that policy should address these differences, that there are distinct challenges, distinct opportunities, and distinct ways of addressing that vision for these different types of rural. The second point that I'd like to mention is that on our side, we have developed what we call statistical definitions to compare trends. And according to the last definition that we use, which essentially defines rural as all the non-metropolitan regions, we find that the majority of rural have a strong, not linkages, but I would say interdependencies with cities. That only the remote rural places are few. Across the OECD, we've estimated about 97 million people live in these places. That's about 8%, but the majority of rural have a strong interaction and links with the urban. We start to talk about a continuum from the rural to the urban and a bit of a different shades of rural. So I think it's very important to link both the rural and the urban agenda. And that's something that we've been trying to do over the last years. The third point, and we heard that before, is a little bit the demographic changes that, or challenges that we have heard already. And we do see that the share of population living in metropolitan regions has virtually increased across all our member countries, except Greece is the only OECD country that has a higher share of population in non-metropolitan regions. And in particular, those that are living in remote places. We find that the category that is rural close to the large metropolitan areas are suffering less demographic challenges than those that are closer to smaller cities, and also the ones that are remotely populated. And also aging is a challenge that we need to take into account in terms of this vision. And here's a tricky place that we heard about before. That is, in a sense, if people are moving, it's because of a reason. So we think that planning ahead is something very important, and having this vision across 30, 40, or 50, or 60 years, having an idea of how the demographic settlements will be and over this long term, and planning for it could be a good way to go. And here I would like to mention the case of Japan. We've learned quite some interesting lessons of how they're developing this long-term vision that we can also take stock. Fourth element that we've seen is there's a growing divide in recent years, and specifically since the global financial crisis in 2007. What we saw before the crisis was that rural areas were not doing as bad. They were converging, in particular the rural remotes and the rural close to medium and small cities. But the crisis has changed these trends, and what we've seen is that bigger cities have weathered the effect of the crisis much better, either due to their more diversified economic base, or the fact that they have been also more protected from international competition, depend more on services and less on tradable activities. So this raises an interesting question in terms of the impact of the current COVID-19. How are rural areas going to be dealing with such shocks? And if more shocks tend to come into the future, this issue of robustness is also something that I think should be tackled in terms of the vision. We've been working a lot about trying to understand what we call the enabling factors around rural. And here, the OECD lingo for that, and I think the Commission as well, is the so-called megatrends. these bigger forces that are operating across our societies. And what we see is that overall, there's a sort of like a shift towards the service sector economy. We think that larger cities have benefited more proportionally from this shift, simply because with density, you have higher productivity on the service economy. And in turn, you have had a lot of decoupling of industry and manufacturing towards the emerging economies. And a lot of these rural areas that were specialized on such activities have suffered from more intense competition. So we think that the opportunities here is to refocus a little bit the areas towards niche markets, towards not as much as low cost products, but more around product differentiation and looking at how to add more value within the context of global value chains. So this is an area that we think is quite important. The second one is that we also see that people are asking for well-being as a priority. It's no longer whether you can grow, whether you can be productive or not, but it's about people. Are people better off in terms of their well-being? Are they becoming better in all of its dimensions? So here, having this holistic view of whether rural policies can deliver across well-being is quite something that is also demanded by inhabitants that are living in rural areas. The third, I also mentioned about the importance of urban and rural linkages, and personally, I think they're only going to get stronger as we go into the future. We talked about the technology and digitalization. That's a very exciting area. I'll come back into that a little bit later, in particular for rural places that have this distance penalty and have this remoteness. So there's a lot of very exciting technologies that can give many opportunities in a broad number of areas, both on the productivity side, but also on quality of life, on delivering services. So I think this opens up a new range of opportunities for some of these rural areas. The demographic challenges that I mentioned before, obviously, OECD member countries are all aging. So we need to come up with realistic and sustainable solutions, how to meet the growing demands of aging and elderly population in some of these rural areas that are more, have a higher share of some of these populations. But also how to take advantage of this economy, the so-called silver economy. This is also an area that I think we can learn from the Japanese and the Korean case. They have a very active population policy for elderly that are living in rural areas, so how to reactivate them back again. And then, of course, the climate change. And I'm also quite happy that the European Commission has set this as a high strategic priority. And I think on the rural side, there's many elements that we can also work towards this climate change and the transition to the so-called low carbon economy. So on our side, the framework that we've developed, it's called the Rural Wellbeing Geography of Opportunities, because we really think that it's about opportunities in terms of rural areas. We also think that the focus should be on people, a people-centered approach to rural well-being. And this is a big change. When you look at some of the past rural policy, they tend to be very commodity-based. It's also about how can we deliver education and health and all the other elements that affect people's lives in rural areas. And many of these policies might be different to what we do in cities and across, on average across the country. So this framework, we're going to be launching it on October the 5th. So we have an official publication coming out. If anybody's interested on participating in this event, please send me an email and we can share with you the webinar. But essentially, it talks about the need to have different objectives in terms of rural development, the economic, the social, the environment, to recognize the diversity of rural places, to work with different actors that are in the rural area. We heard a lot about engagement, about the public, the private, and also the civil society. And then in terms of looking forward and a bit the COVID-19 and the so-called new normality, we've done some work on this. We've produced a policy note that you can find at our hub within the COVID hub across the OECD. But we think this is a very exciting area that opens many new opportunities around teleworking, around digitalization, around new behaviors. So we're trying to see how these opportunities can be realized in the current context. So with that, I think I'll just finalize with my last slide. I've heard a lot about, at the beginning, it's not just a vision, but how to put it into action. On our side, we've created a number of principles. We have 11 principles on rural policy. And on our side, we will try to work with our member countries to implement these principles. And these principles is, in essence, implement this new vision for rural development. So I think that with the OECD, you have a strong ally on developing your long-term vision and on moving the reform agenda forward. So I think I've gone 40 seconds to my 10 minutes, and I'll stop here. Thank you.